Guys, hope everyone is holding up okay. We're gonna be talking in this video about animal behaviors, kind of going off what we were learning about animals before. And then later on this week, we're going to be moving on to some anatomy stuff. And so we'll kind of be connecting what we've been talking about related to animals to anatomy and how the body functions. So it's kind of the plan of where we're going. Um, First of all, I wanted to take a moment to just define what a behavior actually is. It's a word you probably hear all the time, but wanted to kind of give you the science definition for that. So, a behavior is just a response to a stimulus. And a stimulus is anything in your environment that causes a reaction. So, it could be a noise, it could be something someone else is doing or something else is doing. It could be a smell, it could be something you ate, so it could be internal. Um, just a response to something that's happening in or around your environment is a behavior. There are two types of behaviors that animals can do, and they're either innate or they're learned. And innate means that it comes naturally. So this is natural. Um, a lot of times they're genetically coded for. So we'll talk about this in a second, but like instincts and reflexes are innate behaviors. So they're things that, in order to have the response, you or the animal doesn't think about it and doesn't choose that behavior. It's like encoded in them and it's just part of the way they act because it just is. Learned behaviors are behaviors that are gained over time. These are gained through life experience. And then in this video, I'm also going to talk about a couple other behaviors, communication behaviors with animals, and also just a couple other like random ones. But for the most part, behaviors are either innate or they're learned. And everything that you do basically is a behavior. So you can kind of think about some things that you do and whether you think they're innate or that you've learned them. Which is just kind of interesting to think about. And then one thing I definitely want to mention is that both types of behaviors, whether it's innate, natural, or a learned behavior, it's evolutionarily adaptive to do these behaviors. Um, so whether it's like defending your territory against predators or defending your offspring against predators, that those are innate um, behaviors. That's evolutionarily adaptive because you're protecting in the case of offspring, like your future, that's how your genes are going to get passed on. So it's really important to protect to your offspring. And then the ability to learn is, of course, evolutionarily adaptive as well, because you're able to change your behavior in order to fit your changing environment. So if you're unable to learn from the stimuli that are happening around you, whether you're a human or an animal, in terms of natural selection, you're not going to get very far because you won't be able to change with the changing environment. So both types of behaviors are really important and really adaptive for survival. So just to mention that. First thing I want to talk about are innate behaviors. So these are the natural behaviors. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of like a short definition of them and then also an example. A lot of these have really cool like video examples or picture examples. So I'll embed those in the Edpuzzle, but I definitely recommend like Googling them if they're things that you're interested in because there are some like really cool videos on YouTube of animals actually doing these different behaviors. So the first one is just an instinct or a reflex, and these are responses that the brain doesn't have to think about. So you can Google this if you're interested in it, but you actually have nerves that do your reflexes. So, like when the doctor hits your knee and your foot kicks out, that's a reflex. That's a behavior that you're not choosing to do. And actually, it's not even the signal's not even passing through your brain, which is why it's able to happen so quickly. It's just a reflex loop in your spinal cord between neurons. And you can Google a picture of actually what the reflex loop looks like. But that's why it's able to happen so fast and why you don't even think about it and you can't stop it. You can't stop yourself from having that reflex. Um, in animals, instincts are things that they just do at the snap of fingers. Like they just have that reaction in a split second. So you can even kind of see it like in your dogs and your cats, probably if you have pets, like those instinctual behaviors that just quick happen. So I'll put the example here of knee kicking out or foot kicking out, rather foot kicking in response to knee. This is a human example, being hit. Also, like when you fall forward, it's instinctual to put your hands out to break your fall and like protect your face. Um, that's another example of an instinct in humans. Okay, so another one is migration. Migration is actually an innate behavior. It's the animals don't have to learn to migrate if they are migrating animals. So an example of migration, well, first I'll write it. Migration is seasonal movement, and it's always by a group of animals, which we call a population. So there's tons of examples of migration, and a lot of them are really cool. One example is blue whales. Whales migrate from Alaska to South America every year for feeding and then for breeding. Butterflies actually migrate, monarch butterflies. Birds flying south is an example. Flying south for the winter is an example of migration. Um, there are so many. The salmon swimming upstream to lay their eggs is an example. So anytime you have a large group moving together seasonally, it has to be with the seasons, is an example of migration. And then just to note, like they didn't learn that. So like a baby salmon doesn't ever learn to migrate. It's just encoded in them to do it. It's innate, natural. Two examples that are kind of similar to each other, but they're opposites, are hibernation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and estivation. So hibernation is reduced metabolism in response to cold. So one thing that I do want to definitely mention here is that hibernation is not sleeping. It's much deeper than sleeping. It's basically these animals that are hibernating reduce their metabolic rates so low that they're like almost dead. So their breath rate is really, really low. Their heart rate is really, really low. They're just doing like the bare minimum to actually stay alive. And what's crazy is bears hibernate, and mother bears actually can like give birth while they're hibernating, which is crazy. So they're not asleep; they're just like barely alive, intentionally. And then once it starts to get warm, they come out of hibernation and they're, back to life in the spring. But some animals that hibernate are, of course, bears, some snakes, which is why you don't see snakes in the winter. And then, like right about this time, you might have heard like it's starting to be like snake season, and so you have to be more if you're like out gardening in your yard or anything like that. Like you have to be a little bit more aware of the possibility that there could be snakes because they're starting to come out because it's getting warmer. But there are tons more examples too that you can research. And then estivation is the same thing. So it's reduced metabolism in response to heat. So basically, this is to keep from overheating. And usually, hibernation is longer than estivation. Estivation might just be like during the daytime. Crabs do this on the beach in really hot days, which is why you normally won't see like a crab walking around on the sand during the day. But if you go on a walk on the beach at night, the crabs will start to come out and you'll be able to see them if you have flashlights. Um, Same thing with like a lot of desert animals estivate, like desert mice and like prairie dogs will estivate because it gets so hot during the day that they'll come out at night when it's cooler. But it's reduced metabolism, kind of like hibernation, but usually for a shorter time. So I'll say crabs um, staying underground during the day, just to keep from getting too hot. The last one that I'm going to talk about, the last innate behavior, is imprinting, which is a really cool one. And it's basically like the ability of offspring to immediately recognize who their mother is and to know their mother. So I'll put that here. This is recognizing your mother immediately. And the best example, or my favorite example of this at least, is um, ducks and ducklings. And this is why the ducklings will follow the mother duck in a line because they've imprinted on that mother. There's actually a pretty cool example of a a bunch of ducklings that imprinted on a man because he was there when they hatched and they imprinted on him. And I'll link the video on Edpuzzle, but they follow him around in a line because they have imprinted that that's their mother. But it's an innate behavior that allows you to recognize who your mother is, like as a baby. Humans imprint too, but not in the same way that ducklings do, obviously, and birds. So I'll say ducklings following mother. Okay, so those are the innate behaviors that I'm going to talk about: imprinting, estivation, hibernation, migration, and then reflexes and instincts. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about learning. If you're interested in psychology and you ever take a psychology class, whether it's at Gibbons or in college, you'll learn about these different types of learning pretty in depth and how they work on humans and also how they work on animals. But it's pretty interesting. This is the science of kind of how your brain works and how you learn certain things and get good at certain things and basically just learning in general. So it's pretty interesting. The first one that I'm going to talk about is classical conditioning, which you might have heard of before. This is basically how, if you've ever trained a puppy or an animal to do something, you probably used classical conditioning. So this is relating an action to a reward slash consequence. And so it's basically like training an animal. The scientist who came up with classical conditioning is this man named Pavlov, who was a scientist who did this research on dogs. And he got the dogs to associate mealtime with the ringing of a bell. So I'll actually just put on here too that this is associative learning. So you're associating one thing with another. So what Pavlov did is every time he fed the dogs dinner, he would ding a bell. And he did that over and over and over again every single time they ate. And then eventually what he found was that when he dinged the bell, even if he didn't give the dogs food, they started to like salivate, like it was time for them to eat. So basically, he had trained them to associate the bell dinging with being hungry. Um, there are other examples of this, of course. There's one, if you are a fan of The Office, I'll put the link on here. I would have showed it in class if we were in class, but Jim actually uses classical conditioning to get Dwight to associate his computer noise turning on with like eating an Altoid, which is kind of a funny, it's like a prank that he pulls, but you could try it out on your siblings or your parents or something. But I'll put the example on here as Pavlov training dogs to salivate at sound of bell. And it could be any stimulus and any response, and it would still be considered classical conditioning. The other type of conditioning is called operant conditioning, and this is basically just trial and error learning. So the scientist that is responsible for kind of coming up with the idea of operant conditioning was named Skinner, was his last name. And he did a bunch of different experiments using mice in mazes. And he would have them run the same maze over and over again, trying to find like a block of cheese or a treat at the end of the maze. And basically found that with trial and error, the mice got better and better at doing the same maze. So basically, they were like learning from their mistakes. And that's operant conditioning. So you have operantly conditioned yourself in many ways over your life. If you enjoy playing like video games and you've played the same game more than once, you've learned from your mistakes playing the game. In sports, you have used operant conditioning. Probably you like tried shooting a ball one way and it didn't work, so you like didn't do it that way anymore. Um, so basically, just trial and error, learning from your mistakes, learning from failure is operant conditioning. So I'll put on here. I didn't put an example spot. Example is Skinner sending mice through maze over and over. And then the real like point of that is that the mice get better at finding the treat or the cheese in a shorter amount of time. Okay, so two more learned behaviors that I'm going to talk about. The next one is habituation, and it's basically making a habit. So what happens in habituation is that an animal no longer responds to a repeated stimulus. So basically, they learn that that stimulus is going to happen over and over again, and they actually like become desensitized to it and don't react to it anymore. Um, a good example of this with animals is deer and other wildlife coming close to roads and coming close to human areas. Part of it is just that we've encroached on their habitat, but the other part is that they've become habituated to the sounds and the lights of cars. So they no longer like react in fear to them, which obviously ends badly for them often. An example with humans would be like if you moved to a new house that was in a big city and it was always loud. Like if you moved to New York City, the first few nights you moved there, you would be up because the sounds would bother you. But eventually you would no longer really even hear them because you would have become habituated to the sounds. That's that one. So I'll say deer coming close to roads because they're used to the lights and sounds. Okay. And then the last one is insight learning, which is a pretty interesting situation. And that is when an animal is given a set of tools or an array of things and uses them correctly the first time. So this is doing something right the first time. So the example of this that I found that like made the most sense to me was a monkey like using like bricks to climb up and like step to the food. So it like knew that it needed to, or it like processed how to put the blocks together the first time in order to like climb up to the food. So it didn't have to do trial and error. It just like had this, it's kind of like a light bulb moment um, where they just know like this is how I need to arrange these items in order to get to this thing. So that's the best example that I can kind of think of. You might be able to find a better one on the internet. So I'll say monkey stacking blocks to climb to food. So just as long as it's like happening the first time the right way, um, it's insight and not operant conditioning. Okay, so now I just wanted to talk really quickly about some different communication behaviors because whether you've like thought about it that way or not, communication actually is a behavior that animals, including us, do. We're very vocal in our communication, and other animals are less vocal. So I want to talk about some of those. One way that animals can communicate is using pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals. I'll say scents slash trails animals use to send messages to each other. Often this is done during mating season. So animals will release like a specific chemical that other animals in their species can sense and like know that it's time to mate. Also, ants use pheromones to make their trails. So if you have like an ant trail going through your kitchen, hopefully not, but if you do, they are actually are leaving a chemical trail behind, and that's how all the other ants know to like fall in line and follow that path. So that's pheromones. Humans don't really use pheromones, but there is like some evidence that you have like a specific smell that is only yours, and people who are related to you have like a similar smell to you, but not exactly the same. Like you have your own unique odor, which is not like not like a gross like bo, like an odor that you can't even really pick up on. It's kind of like if you walked into someone else's house and you can smell like it's a little bit different, or if you like ever have a sleepover with someone and you can like their clothes smell different than yours. It's kind of like that. So yeah. And then vocal is obviously using sounds to communicate, which we do a lot as humans. We use language mostly, or we should at least to communicate. But other animals use sounds too. So birds communicate using sounds. Frogs have like specific different lengths of their rivets to speak to each other and to communicate messages. So that's vocal. It's fairly whales will sing. And then movement. Some animals actually can communicate by using specific movements of their body. This is using specific movement to send messages. And the coolest example of this is bees. And there's a specific dance that bees do. It's called the waggle dance, which is a funny name, but it is really called that. And they actually can communicate like the exact distance a a flower is from the hive if it's like a good pollen source for them. I'll link a video to it, but it's like really mathematically amazing that they're able to do it. So that's one movement example. All right, almost done. Just want to talk about these two more that are kind of in their own category. So both of these are innate behaviors, but they're very specific. So courtship and territorial defense. Courtship is mating rituals used to attract mates. Usually in animals, this is done, it's like a behavior done by the male to attract the female. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked about evolution and sexual dimorphism and how the males like exhibit specific behaviors and sexual selection. So examples are like those birds of paradise that do the specific dancing to attract mates or like clean up the area around like the female bird. Um, not only done in birds, but birds is the best example because they're like so obvious and colorful and loud. So just trying to attract a mate is courtship. And then territorial defense is defending your territory. So this is taking action to protect either resources, so like food or land, mates, or offspring. And some animals are a lot more territorial than others. One example of a really territorial animal is geese. So if you've ever gotten like too close to a goose, especially like a mother goose, it's like actually very scary and there's a lot of hissing and um, it's like pretty intense. Swans too are like very very territorial birds, so you'll want to stay away from them. But yeah, so that's territorial defense, just acting um, in a way that scares off anything else. When cats like puff up their fur and like make their tails really big, that's a type of territorial defense where they're trying to like make themselves look bigger and scarier in order to like protect their area or um, their kittens. So yeah, that's a quick overview. I know it didn't feel quick, but it is quick. Overview of some different animal behaviors. There are other ones, and this was also just like a very brief discussion with like a few examples. So definitely, like if you're interested in any of these, go out there and like learn more and tell me about it. I would love to know. Um, yeah, that's it for this time. So thank you so much. I miss you guys and hope to talk to you soon. Bye.